as we go on to our next session, our two keynote speakers have kindly agreed to join us for a panel discussion on the vital subjects that they have raised. To moderate this discussion and introduce our distinguished panel, I am delighted to say we have Ms. Kim Hoo-ran, the Culture Desk Editor at Korea's premier English language newspaper, the Korea Herald. Welcome, Hoo-ran, and let me pass the mic over to you.
All right. Good morning and good evening. Let me first of all introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Benoit Bosquet joining us online, and he's the Regional Director of Sustainable Development in the East Asia and Pacific region at the World Bank. We also have Ms. Choi Ji-woo joining us online. She's the Deputy Director of Green Climate Fund's Private Sector Facility, supervising private sector climate finance for GCF. Also joining us online is Dr. Frank Rasberman. He's the Director General of Global Green Growth Institute. And here with me on stage is Dr. Kim Sung-woo, the Head of Environment and Energy Research Center at Kim Il-jang, and he's also Adjunct Professor at Korea University in Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I think I've introduced our panelists who will take part in our panel discussion, which is divided into two parts. So for the first part, we have a common question that I'll pose to the four panelists, and that will be followed by questions from the floor, actually from our audiences on YouTube. We are invited at this point to post your questions indicating to which of the panelists or speakers the question is directed, and we'll take those in the second part of the discussion. Okay, so we'll start with a common question, which is, what is your view on greening the post-COVID recovery for developing countries, and what efforts are being made at your organization toward tackling this issue? Could we start with Dr. Bosquet, please?
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
perfectly.
excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great. It's my first time, and having heard the first set of presentations, including, of course, from my dear colleague Richard, but also from Ms. Oh and the fascinating expose she gave on the Korean New Deal. I hope this is not the last time that we interact. In fact, jumping the gun a little bit, I would suggest that we perhaps include carbon pricing in the scope of our collaboration in the future. But I will come back to this in a second. And fellow panelists, greetings as well. It's an honor to be here with you. I would like to perhaps focus, I know we only have about 3 minutes, on the what the World Bank East Asia and Pacific region is doing to approach climate action as part of the green recovery from COVID. I think it's a critical angle, and through this angle we can really carry a whole lot of the sustainability greening agenda. So let me perhaps mention briefly 7 specific actions that we are including in our regional climate change action plan, and you'll hear some echoes, in fact, of the points mentioned by Mrs. Ho in her presentation. So just as in the Korean New Deal, energy is absolutely key. and we are doing a lot there. We plan to do more at the World Bank by supporting investments, but also, leading policy dialogue for the development of renewable energy, by integrating renewable energy grids, but also by tackling now head-on this question of the just transition from coal. Looking at the social aspects of fuel subsidy, retrenchment and mine closure, for example. In the transport sector, we will be pursuing e-mobility, pushing, better land use and transport planning, multimodal integration to increase the use of railways and waterways, and also going into low carbon maritime transport, which is new for us. On the industrial side, the application, the adoption of climate change strategies for industrial strategies is an area for the future. Sustainable cooling and the HFC phase down benefits that has. There's a lot still to be done in East Asia. Green public procurement in various branches of industry. I know I'm running out of time. In the agricultural sector, the just rural transition, where this is a topic that Jürgen Vogeler is really leading us on, redirecting agricultural support that is currently tied to specific uses, inputs or practices to the production of specific outputs, and to promote protecting and restoring ecosystems. Still putting as much money in the pockets of the farmers, but to do good things as opposed to destructive things. The rice sector is a huge topic for the region, huge emitter of greenhouse gases, and big reductions are possible through better hydrological regimes. We're also going to support more actions in biodiversity, recognizing that without a healthy biological diversity, there cannot be really long-term sustainable development, resilient development, and low carbon development. We're going to do more in cities, recognizing that cities continue to grow in the region and are a big share of emissions. And then finally, and I will come back to it if possible, carbon pricing, helping countries putting in place the building blocks, the measurement, the reporting, verification, the legal aspects, the technical design, the administrative regulations for either carbon taxes or emissions trading system. So let me leave it at this. Thank you so much.
Sorry, thank you very much. Now we move on to Ms. Choi, and you have 3 minutes. Okay, Ms. Choi, you need to turn on your microphone, please. Okay, we seem to be having a bit of a problem. Then could we move on to Dr. Risperman while Ms. Choi prepares to speak? Would that be fine? Okay, Dr. Risperman is also, we're not getting your sound feed.
I think she can speak now.
Okay,
Yep.
we can hear you now.
Can you hear me okay?
Okay, I can hear you, Ms. Choi, too. Okay, then could we go back to our original plan and start with Ms. Choi?
Great. Thank you, Huran, and thank you for the invitation to this very timely and interesting panel discussions today. Before I get started, actually, I would like to remind us all on where we are in terms of our progress toward the Paris Agreement in a collective sense. Simply put, we're not on track to achieve either Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 or net zero economy by 2050. The past decade was the hardest on record. After a temporary decline from lockdowns in 2020, the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere already headed back to the pre-pandemic levels. The CO2 concentration in atmosphere has increased from 280 ppm in the pre-industrial period to 417 ppm in 2020, and now it surged past 400 ppm for the first time in recorded history, quite actually recently, 3rd of April this year, 2021. The climate crisis impacts people and ecosystems, exacerbating inequalities and tensions. The COVID-19 has compounded this stark reality and creating broad economic consequences. In response to this unprecedented health and economic crisis, G20 countries are undertaking large-scale expansionary fiscal and monetary measures. As of March 2021, G20 countries have been able to allocate over $14 trillion on stimulus package to revive their economies. On the other hand, most developing countries do not have the same monetary and fiscal space to roll out ambitious recovery measures. The sharp drop in public revenues in foreign direct investment and remittances and the rising debt burden have added stress to government balance sheets and threatened to wipe out decades of socio-economic gains. Such a reversal would make it impossible for the global community to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and would increase the vulnerability of people, communities, companies, societies, and ecosystems to climate change. As you see, the COVID-19 has brought us to a tipping point or turning point in the fight against the climate change. Decisions taken by leaders today to revive the economies will either entrench our dependence on fossil fuels or put us on a path to achieve Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. For the COVID-19 pandemic to prove to be a turning point, climate action and COVID-19 economic stimulus measures must be mutually supportive and aligned. And developing countries must be able to access long-term, affordable finance to develop and implement green stimulus measures. So in response to this, GCF has been working very closely with key stakeholders, among many others, with government on policy and with private sector investors and entrepreneurs on actions. From policy perspective, we are actually working very closely with the developing countries to leverage ongoing NDC enhancement efforts to foster the policy integration between the climate action and economic recovery. And from the private sector investment point of view, we are actually structuring and tailoring our financing modalities and mechanisms to shift financial flows towards a low carbon, climate resilient project in developing countries by de-risking and creating green markets while not increasing the sovereign debt burden. So we are focusing more on catalytic financial instruments such as guarantee and equity for our modalities for intervention, and of course grants for the support to the government. If I have a chance later today in the session, I would love to share with you the example of our project that we have been doing from last year to this year. But for now, I'll stop here and give the floor back to Huran. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now we move on to Dr. Rasberman, please.
Thank you, and allowing me to unmute. I'm heading an intergovernmental organization headquartered in Seoul, We have now 39 members, and our sole mission is to support the green transformation of our member countries, particularly developing and emerging economies. So this question of whether there can be a green recovery from COVID is particularly pertinent. And many of the speakers have already indicated why it is necessary. But let me remind you first that even countries that managed the pandemic quite well, in the Pacific for instance, have been extremely hard hit by the recession. Countries like Fiji, that derived almost 40% of their revenue for the whole economy from tourism, saw that dry up in one day when the planes stopped coming. That's an incredible crisis that is outpacing anything that we see here in Korea. In Peru, they saw their worst economic crisis in their country's history. And in Cambodia and in Mongolia, rather than people now thinking of the end of the crisis and vaccinations, they are actually currently hit particularly hard by new waves and are entering new forms of lockdown. So that is the background against which we are discussing this green recovery. Many of our member countries' head is still just not there. They're very skeptical. They look at, yes, the Biden administration's huge investments in recovery, the outlays of the EU and countries like Korea, and they say, this is not for us. So the first role that organizations like my own and GCF and World Bank have is to convince developing countries that despite these difficult conditions, green recovery is still the only recovery that is really the best way open to them. And the most powerful argument we have found is that green recovery can bring more green jobs. Investment in renewable energy, as quite a few studies have shown, brings many more jobs than investments in coal-fired power plants or others. Of course, those that build coal-fired power plants, if we want to stop them, are very effective in arguing that that means job losses. But we have to indeed remind those governments that there will be many more jobs gained from renewable energy investments and indeed from nature-based solutions. If there is one difference between the green deals that we think are appropriate for developing countries compared to the digital and Green New Deal that Professor Oh explained, it is that while digital and green renewable energy investments are also important, there's a much greater scope for investments in agriculture, reforestation, climate-smart agriculture, nature-based solutions in general, which are both a better opportunity for those countries because so many more of their poor and unemployed or marginally employed people are in those sectors, but also I think because it's less investment required. Many countries have prepared NDCs, and indeed, as Ms. Choi just indicated, implementation isn't going fast enough. When those NDCs were prepared, mostly the impact on reduced greenhouse gas emission was shown. So we have started an effort to show that if you actually implement the NDCs as promised, you'll generate large numbers of green jobs. So you don't even have to come up with a separate Green New Deal. You can simply implement your NDCs, and for Mexico that would generate between 1 and 2 million new green jobs. For Indonesia, even more. So I think there are some really powerful arguments why developing countries should recover in a green manner. But yes, the biggest difference between Korea and those countries is they simply do not have the finances. So they will have to turn to the GCF for climate finance, to carbon markets, carbon finance, to ODA, and we believe particularly to the private sector. So that is, I think, a very important message to the Korean private sector. Yes, Korea is doing good at home, but Korea has also been a very large investor in coal-fired power plants in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and Mongolia. And yes, that does create some jobs in Korea. But the Korean private sector could do so much better if it helped with the green transition. And in Vietnam, for instance, we helped develop a project to take plastic refuse out of the landfill, turn it into refuse-derived fuel, and that can then either be turned into energy or into fuel for cement plants that are currently importing cheap coal from Indonesia. That actually was an investment from a local private sector entity with a local bank, but only possible because we were able to find, in that case, a Finnish credit guarantee that made that project financially attractive. And yes, the GCF, as Choi didn't say it explicitly, but I know, is very ready to not just give grants, but to do high-risk investments, to provide equity, to provide first loss, to provide credit guarantees. And those have the potential to leverage the private sector, to make projects that might not be attractive for the private sector attractive. And I think, frankly, that's the only way that we can see a green recovery happening in developing countries.
Okay,
Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. We've gone over 5 minutes, so now we'll move to Dr. Kim, who's on stage with us in Seoul.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the World Bank Group to invite me to this meaningful and timely event. My view on the greening recovery, I think there are 3 factors to be balanced for successful greening recovery, or green growth if you like, for all countries. The first one would be, of course, the green infra investment, and second would be carbon pricing, as some of the colleagues mentioned, and third would be technology development. We need all those 3 ingredients into the table to be balanced for successful greening recovery. I just would like to propose just one thing for the developing countries to consider the policies related to these 3 factors for successful greening recovery. That is, please benchmark Korean policies related to those 3 factors. The reasons are followings. The Korea, we have pretty similar growth rate with the developing countries rather than the developed countries. And also we, as you know, for green infrastructure investment, as Hyung-na mentioned, we started the Green New Deal policy in 2020. And for carbon pricing, as you know, we started carbon emission trading scheme in 2015. And for technology development, government just announced net zero technology development roadmap last month. And I was sitting in all the committees related to those 3 factors. And I'm not saying the Korean policies are always successful, but we do have some failures and we do have some revisions related to those policies, but it will give some meaningful lessons for the developing countries to consider those 3 factors for successful greening recovery, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheels for this green growth and greening recovery. And lastly, what the Kim and Jang does for this transition, of course, the Kim and Jang, as you know, that we are the biggest law firm in Korea. We do have climate change and outbound investment team, dedicated team, which I belong to. And what we do is we help the private sector, especially corporates and investors, to successfully allocate their resources, the money and people, toward this net zero and ESG era on decarbonization strategy, renewable energy investment, and ESG engagement. So these are what we do, and hopefully this will give the good sort of suggestion for this session. Back to you, Chair.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kim. That brings us to the end of the first part of the panel discussion. We are sort of ahead of time. Okay, for the second part, we will invite the speakers as well to respond to the questions. We'll start first with Sorry, I have this. Yes, Dr. O. A question for Dr. O. Okay, so the question is, Dr. O, is there a difference that you see in the approach toward green growth taken in the 2000s and 2010 versus the green growth that's being discussed today?
Yeah, the big difference was found from the private sector. In early 2000 or 2010, the green growth or the green investments was considered as a cost, but now that they consider it as the new the business opportunity, because the statistics are somewhat different. Some statistics shows that the ESG management is profitable, but some statistics shows the opposite outcome. But the Korean big companies, including Samsung and SK, considers that the high carbon intensive industries do not have a very bright future. So they started to focus on the green investment from the private business perspective. So I think this is a big difference from the previous regime's green growth strategy period.
All right. Thank you, Dr. O. Now we have a question for Dr. Kim. And you have 3 minutes to respond. And the question is, how could more private capital be redirected into greening the post-COVID recovery?
Thank you for the great question of importance. As the environment and energy expert from private sector, I think we have heard so many years of the same question: how are we going to leverage the private capital and private investment? So we have talked about use the public money's financial instruments to take more risk to attract private capital. So we know solutions, and I think the Ms. Che and Frank are doing a great job, and World Bank is great job for that. I would like to just propose on top of that, recently I think for the public sector, I think you can leverage 2 more followings. The first one, you can leverage to attract of course, the private capital. The first one is please leverage green raising benefit of private capital. And when you attract private capital by investing in public capital. And second, please leverage ESG management benefit that the private capital would enjoy if the private capital redirect their money into the greening recovery. So on top of that financial instrument that you have used to attract the private capital, I think those 2 sort of initiative, those 2 are the initiatives that you can leverage. The first, just one example would be for the green racing is, let's take an example of India. Within 10 years, the Modi said that India will have 450 gigawatt of renewable energy investment within 10 years. That's a huge amount of money, and that's a huge amount of the investment opportunity, not only for public sector, but for the private sector to raise in green. If one private capital do not invest in that market, others will do. So I think this is good rhetoric that public sector can leverage to attract the private capital. And second, the ESG management. Let me just take an example of some investors, of European investors, like, you know, the 13 European investors, including Amundi, filed the shareholder resolution for HSBC to reduce financing to fossil fuel and redirect their capital into renewable energy. It's not the public sector to drive this redirection. It's the public sector itself are doing and trying to redirect the capital into the greening recovery by ourselves. So from the public perspective, public capital's perspective and MDB's perspective, I think it's very important to cooperate with this ESG initiative within private sector to align with your goal, because we are assuming this, aiming to the same the Paris Agreement goal. So I think those are two things that you can leverage on top of the financial institution to attract more private capital. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. And now we have a question for Dr. Busquet. And the question is, how can Korea's experience inspire the efforts of other countries in East Asia and beyond as they strive to green their recovery from COVID? And you have
Thank
3
you.
minutes.
Thank you so much. Look, in fact, it's in a way the topic of Dr. Kim's previous interventions as well, but I would perhaps like to focus on carbon pricing, right? I mean, to a large extent, Korea is the shining light for the rest of the world with its zero, with its carbon neutrality objective, the Korean New Deal, and now the Green New Deal. But let me focus on the emissions trading system for a second. So a lot already has been done, and we are full of admiration. You know, the ETS of Korea already covers 3/4 of domestic emissions. And recent allowance prices hover around the equivalent of $20. So that's very good. But it's not to say that you cannot improve and show the way for other countries to follow you. And let me borrow a few ideas from a recent paper by a colleague from the International Monetary Fund, Ian Perry, who reviewed the fiscal policies of Korea. He thinks, and having studied this quite a bit myself and practiced as well, that indeed, you could, further reduce the overall cap within which trading occurs, because as of now, Korea is actually not on track to meet its NDC pledge for 2030, for example. In addition, there is a possibility of limiting the uncertainty in the price fluctuations of these allowances. The prices could go too low, which is what happened in Europe some time ago. It could also go too high. And so setting a price band with a price floor and a price ceiling, and letting then the prices of the allowances fluctuate within that band may be a good idea. And then finally, and perhaps the most important one, is what to do with the revenues of these allowances. So Korea, like the EU, opted, if I understand correctly, for allocating the allowances for free, which makes a lot of sense from a political economy perspective. But as such, the system does not capture the full revenue potential of these allowances. If these allowances were auctioned off, there could be a significant generation of revenues that could then be used to reduce taxation elsewhere. It's the principle of extracting value taxing what you want less of, like pollution or resource exhaustion, and then using these revenues to encourage what you want more of, and in particular, employment. As Frank was saying earlier, this is going to be a key factor in being able to sell green recovery, right? It's the job, the employment potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question from our audience, and it's directed toward Dr. Damania. The question is, how can Korea and the World Bank work together to promote green, resilient, inclusive recovery?
Well, I'm delighted to say that Korea and the World Bank already are working together to promote green, resilient, and inclusive recoveries. But not just that, even before COVID hit, of course, we had this trust fund that was solidly and consistently trying to promote more efficient energy usage, better agriculture, better water usage, etc., for a very long period of time. I think there's a couple of things in which the Korean experience is particularly good. One is on the innovation. We heard from my colleague Jürgen about, for example, insect protein and the tremendous potential that actually has. It sounds odd to many people, but it's got huge potential. Korea is a world leader in that. But across many aspects of technology and innovation, I think the Korean experience is particularly relevant in developing countries because, there is that experience and there is that closeness being located in East Asia and elsewhere, which is enormously useful. So I think, dare I say it, it's almost the ideal partnership that we have in terms of greening growth and taking things forward. And one of the things I think that's actually key is, unlike so many other countries, Korea has been consistent on the subject of wants to recognize that green growth confers benefits that you don't get along, let's say, the dirty growth path. It's been fairly consistent in its support and in its innovation. So I think, greater sort of partnerships that we have of the kind that we actually have would be absolutely wonderful to take this forward. And then finally, as I said, and just to repeat that, one of the gifts that Korea can give the world, I think, is in innovation, because Korea has proven itself to be especially good at being able to finance and promote innovation that has often been elusive elsewhere, and putting much more effort, I think, government effort into promoting clean innovation, I think would be tremendous, in the realm of batteries, in the realm of transport, in the realm of agriculture, water usage, etc., where we really, really struggle. So I think the opportunities are vast. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before we take the final question, Dr. Wu has asked me if she might be able to pose a question, and if this is all right, I would go ahead and ask Dr. Oh to ask a question.
Yeah, my question goes to the World Bank Group members. It is true that the implementing Green New Deal or the 2050 carbon neutrality is quite costly. So there is a financial burden for the public sector. So we have some concerns on the nation's debt, because we expect that the cost of pursuing the 2050 carbon neutrality will cause at least 2% of the GDP every year. So my question is how to manage the nation's debt associated with the Green New Deal or the carbon neutrality. Thank you.
So that was addressed to the World Bank. So it's up to anyone's free to take this question. Would anyone like to take up this question?
Shall I very quickly start, Benoit, and then hand over to you?
Okay.
Look, this is a very, very good point. And the World Bank is very, very fully aware of this, that there is an additional cost to pursuing a carbon neutral path or a zero carbon path or reducing your carbon footprint. But might I remind everyone, there's also a very, very significant cost in not doing that in terms of human health and the lower resilience. And that's an economic cost. It's a cost to human health. It's not a financial cost. So let's take the question just in terms of financial costs. We're aware of that, so we're helping countries to develop new kinds of financial instruments. We heard about some of them now in terms of new bonds and new green bonds, etc., that one can develop. But also it's very much work in progress and no agreements have been made. But there's even talk of having, if you like, debt relief based on meaningful and long-term actions that address deep environmental problems, learning from, of course, the mistakes of the past. And there's efforts to actually raise special funds just to do this, and special funds to ensure that we have transitions that are just and transitions that are equitable, and that we look after the people that might lose out from any such transition that we have. So that's my 2 cents on it. Benoit, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think this is indeed a key question, and I'm sure Dr. Choi of the GCF and Frank also will have views on this, and Dr. Kim addressed this question before. But I would say, first of all, yes, there is potentially a debt, but there's an investment, and there's going to be a return on investment, right? And/or cost savings. And I think that goes to Richard's point. But then again, to go back then to carbon pricing, if you put a price on carbon, you send a very strong signal to the investors, in particular the private investors. And so the private investors are going to bear a lot of the investment cost for these green investments because they know those are profitable in the long term. So I think we should not overly focus on the debt burden to the government, but also see how the private sector can invest if the proper signals, the incentives, are provided.
Okay, so I have one last question, and it's addressed to Frank and Chiu. That last question is, how can the World Bank Group work together with your organization to promote green, resilient recovery? Frank, if you could take up the question first. You each have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, and indeed, right from the establishment of GGGI, the World Bank Group and OECD, UNEP and GGI have been collaborating in something called the Green Growth Knowledge Platform as a way to share knowledge among us and to be on the same path. And in some countries like Laos, for instance, the Green Growth Trust Fund that we are discussing here provided funds to the World Bank to actually make a loan to the government, which they conditioned on the country having a clear green growth strategy. And actually GGI was in the country to help the country develop such a green growth strategy and take the kind of policy measures that enabled the World Bank then to release its loan. Those are, I think, good practical examples where we support each other. We provide technical assistance, if you like, to governments, both on policies and on originating investment projects that the World Bank and GCF and other financiers can then indeed take up. So I think there is ample scope to continue such collaboration in many more countries. Thank you.
GCF, together with GGGI and World Bank, we're actually closely working together to promote the green growth for developing countries. But these days, I think adaptation finance is more urgent. It's because I think there has been $30 billion on average adaptation finance for developing countries in 2017 and 18. But because of this COVID-19, the adaptation finance is becoming more scarce. And then, as Richard said, I think human capital is at stake, and it's actually probably more valuable than anything else that we can think of. So we are actually trying to find the way to transfer the adaptation technology from developed side to developing worlds, as Richard again and Vinod and Frank said, so that the technology, the reach of the technology is benefiting the developing countries, which will be the fastest way to actually promote the green recovery for all, and which could be inclusive. Thank you.
I think that's a sign for us to move on. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk, and we got many different approaches to our common goal.